3:42 in the morning, Fort Bragg, North Carolina. The military police dispatcher answers a call. The voice on the other end is a whisper, a man's voice, the voice of an army captain, a doctor. He says 8 words. Help me, stabbed, my wife and kids. The line goes quiet. The dispatcher tries to keep him talking. There is no answer. The dispatcher sends military police and an ambulance to the address. 544 Castle Drive, a set of officers' quarters on the base. The MPs drive through the rain. They do not know it yet, but they are about to walk into a crime scene that will divide America for 55 years. A crime scene with 3 victims, 1 survivor, and a story that the survivor will spend the rest of his life telling. A story about 4 intruders. A story about a woman in a floppy hat chanting acid is groovy. A story that almost nobody, not the Army investigators, not the prosecutors, not the juries will ever believe. It is the morning of February 17th, 1970, and the man making the phone call, the Princeton-educated Green Beret doctor with the promising career and the beautiful young family, is about to become the center of one of the longest-running murder cases in American history. This is the case of Jeffrey MacDonald, the case that inspired the book Fatal Vision, the case that put a husband and father in prison for the murder of his pregnant wife and 2 little girls, and the case that one man, a father-in-law named Freddy Kassab, would spend the next 23 years of his life refusing to let go. To understand what happened in that house on Castle Drive, you need to start earlier. You need to start with the woman who died that night, because before she became a name on a police report, before she became the center of a murder case that reached the Supreme Court twice, she was somebody's daughter, somebody's wife, somebody's mother. Her name was Colette Stevenson. She was born in 1943 on Long Island, New York. Her mother, Mildred, remarried when Colette was young. Her stepfather was a man named Alfred Kassab. Everyone called him Freddy, a Canadian-born veteran of World War II, a decorated soldier, a man who had served behind enemy lines. Freddy Kassab raised Colette as his own daughter. He walked her to school. He taught her to drive. He was there when she brought home her first boyfriend, a local kid from Patchogue High School, a boy named Jeffrey MacDonald. Jeffrey and Colette dated through high school. They dated through college. Jeffrey went to Princeton. Colette went to Skidmore. They wrote letters. They visited each other on weekends. They were, by every account, in love. They married in 1963. Colette was 20 years old. Jeffrey was 20. Within a year, she was pregnant with their first daughter, Kimberly. 2 years later, Kristen was born. By the time Jeffrey completed medical school at Northwestern and joined the Army as an officer, the MacDonalds were a family of 4. In the summer of 1969, Captain Jeffrey MacDonald recently graduated from the Green Beret training. Program was transferred to Fort Bragg. The family moved into officers' quarters on the base. A 2-story duplex at 544 Castle Drive. They bought a pony for the girls. They called the pony Trooper. It was, by the winter of 1970, a fairy tale existence. Jeffrey was a captain, a doctor, and an elite special forces officer. He was 26 years old. Colette was 26, taking a night class in developmental psychology. She was 4.5 months pregnant with their 3rd child, a boy. They had the pony, they had the daughters, they had the future, and they had Freddy Kassab. Colette's stepfather, who lived on Long Island, adored his son-in-law, Jeffrey. He bragged about him to the neighbors. The Princeton boy, the Army doctor, the handsome Green Beret who had made his daughter happy. Freddy was proud of Jeffrey in the way that fathers-in-law rarely get to be. Remember that. It matters. Because what Freddy Kassab felt for Jeffrey MacDonald in the winter of 1970 would, within a few short years, turn into something else entirely. The afternoon of February 16th, 1970, was a Monday, a cold, drizzly North Carolina winter day. Jeffrey MacDonald came home from the hospital in the early afternoon. He took Kimberly and Kristen out to see the pony, Trooper, the Christmas pony he had, bought them 6 weeks earlier. He lifted the girls up one at a time, let them sit in the saddle, led the pony in slow circles around the field. Kimberly was 5, Kristen was 2. When they came home, Kimberly's hair still smelled like the horse. Her mother gave her a bath, put her in her favorite pajamas, the ones with the little flowers on them, read her a story, tucked her into bed. That is the last normal evening this family ever had. Colette left the house at around 5:45 to go to her evening class. The class ran until 9:30. While she was gone, Jeffrey fed the girls, put them in their pajamas, played with them on the living room floor. Kristen, the 2-year-old, had a favorite game she played with her father. She called it Horsey. Jeffrey would get down on his hands and knees, and Kristen would climb on his back, and he would crawl around pretending Stombaugh, like Trooper, like the Christmas pony. That's what she was doing that night, the last night of her life. Colette came home from class at around 9:40. The 2 girls were already in bed. Jeffrey and Colette sat in the living room for a while. Colette drank a glass of Cointreau. Jeffrey had a drink with her. At some point around 11, Colette went to bed. Jeffrey stayed up in the living room. He watched the end of a late-night movie. He read a novel. At around 2 in the morning, he decided to come to bed. But when he walked into the master bedroom, he found Kristen, the 2-year-old, sleeping on his side of the bed. She had crawled in at some point during the night, and she had wet the bed. MacDonald carried her back to her own room. He didn't want to sleep in a wet bed, so he grabbed a blanket and went back to the living room, lay down on the couch. According to his own account, that is where he fell asleep at around 2 in the morning. That is MacDonald's version. Remember that, because what happened next, MacDonald would describe in extraordinary detail over the next 55 years in military hearings, in grand jury testimony, in federal trial transcripts, in televised interviews. He would tell this story almost word for word thousands of times. He said he was awakened by screams. His wife, Colette, was screaming, "Jeff, Jeff, why are they doing this to me?" His daughter, Kimberly, was screaming, "Daddy, Daddy." MacDonald said he sat up on the couch and saw 4 people standing in his living room, 3 men and a woman. 2 of the men were white. One was black. They were dressed in dark clothes. One was carrying a baseball bat. Another had a knife. The woman, MacDonald said, was white. She had long blonde hair. She was wearing a floppy hat. She was holding a candle, and she was chanting, "Acid is groovy. Kill the pigs." If that phrase sounds familiar, it is because America had heard it before. 6 months earlier, in the summer of 1969, a cult led by Charles Manson had murdered 5 people in Los Angeles, including the actress Sharon Tate, 8.5 months pregnant. The Manson family had scrawled the word "pig in blood" on the victims' walls. They had chanted slogans about killing pigs. The killings had been the front page of every newspaper in America for months, and they were the subject of a lengthy article in the February 1970 issue of Esquire magazine, an issue that investigators would later find with a blood stain on the edge of the pages in the living room of Jeffrey MacDonald's house. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. According to MacDonald, the 4 intruders attacked him. They beat him with the baseball bat. They stabbed at him with an ice pick. During the struggle, his blue pajama top was pulled up over his head and wrapped around his arms. He used it to try to block the blows. He was stabbed in the chest. He lost consciousness. When he woke up, the house was silent. MacDonald said he stood up, stumbled down the hallway, found his wife on the floor of the master bedroom. She had been beaten severely. Her skull was fractured. Both of her arms were broken, the kind of defensive injuries that happen when you raise your hands to shield your face. Her chest had been stabbed more than 30 times, once with a kitchen knife, 21 times with an ice pick. His blue pajama top was laying across her chest. MacDonald said he had placed it there. He had tried mouth to mouth. It didn't work. He walked down the hallway to Kimberly's room. His 5-year-old daughter was in bed. She had been clubbed in the head so hard that her brain matter was on the door frame. She had been stabbed in the neck 8 to 10 times. He crossed the hall to Kristen's room. The 2-year-old, his baby, the one who had wet the bed, the one who played horsey on his back a few hours earlier. Kristen had been stabbed 33 times with a knife, 15 times with the ice pick. She died in her own bed, holding her bottle. That is a total of 48 stab wounds on a 2-year-old child. MacDonald said he tried to revive each of them. It didn't work. He said he stumbled to the phone, dialed the operator, gave her the address, passed out again. The MPs were on their way. When the first military police officer walked through the front door at 3:55 in the morning, he walked into a scene he would spend the rest of his career trying to forget. His name was Kenneth Micah. He was 23 years old, a young lieutenant. Micah had never seen a homicide scene before. What he saw inside the MacDonald house would make him physically ill within the hour. He would describe it 40 years later as the worst thing I have ever seen in my life. Colette MacDonald was on the floor of the master bedroom. Her face was beaten beyond recognition. The word pig was written in her blood on the headboard of the bed. Her husband's pajama top lay across her chest. Kimberly was in her bed. Her face was turned toward the wall. Her blood had soaked the sheets. Kristen was in her bed across the hall, her small body curled toward her pillow, a baby bottle beside her. And in the master bedroom, lying on the floor next to his wife, Jeffrey, MacDonald was alive. His pajama top was off. There was a small stab wound in his chest. He was breathing. He was conscious. He was the only one. An ambulance arrived. MacDonald was loaded on a stretcher. On the way to Womack Army Hospital, the doctor who treated him would later note that the stab wound in his chest was clean, narrow, and non-life-threatening. It had caused a partial lung collapse, a condition called a pneumothorax, a serious injury for a civilian, a relatively simple problem for a trained physician to treat, specifically for a physician to treat on himself. Remember that too. It will matter later. By 8 in the morning, while MacDonald was being admitted to the hospital, Army investigators had arrived at the scene. A criminal investigation division agent named William Ivory took charge. Ivory was 34 years old, an Army investigator for 6 years. Ivory walked through the house, and almost immediately, he began to notice things that did not fit, things that contradicted what MacDonald had told the first officers on the scene. In the living room, where MacDonald said the violent struggle with 4 intruders had taken place, where he said he had been beaten and stabbed, where his pajama top had been torn in, the fight, Ivory saw almost nothing out of place. A coffee table had been knocked over. A flower pot had fallen. That was it. No broken furniture, no smashed lamps, no holes in the walls, no fingerprints from the intruders, no footprints tracked in from outside, despite it having rained all night. There were not even any bloody footprints leading away from the house. Jeffrey MacDonald, according to his own account, had been stabbed repeatedly in a brutal struggle. He had then walked through 3 rooms of the house, bleeding, but the bloody footprints Ivory could identify on the floor belonged only to MacDonald, and they all went one direction, out of the bedrooms, not into them. Then there was the issue of the pajama top, the blue pajama top, the one MacDonald said had been torn during his struggle, the one he said he had wrapped around his arms to block the ice pick blows, the one that, when the MPs arrived, was lying neatly across the chest of his dead wife. Ivory picked up that pajama top. He examined it. It had 48 puncture holes in it, smooth, cylindrical holes, the kind made by an ice pick going through fabric. And the holes were not torn. They were not ragged around the edges. They were clean, which, to any investigator who had processed a stabbing before, meant one thing. The garment had been stationary when the holes were made, not moving, not being used as a shield, not wrapped around flailing arms in a fight for one's life. The pajama top had been laid flat, and the ice pick had gone through it 48 times into whatever was underneath, into whoever was underneath. Ivory didn't have to be a forensics expert to understand what he was looking at, but he didn't say anything. Not yet. He kept walking, kept cataloging, and he noticed, next to the living room, coffee table, a copy of Esquire magazine, the February 1970 issue. The issue was open. It was lying face up. It had a smear of blood along the top edge of the pages, as if someone had leafed through it with a bloody hand. The article the magazine was open to was titled "The Hippies and the Manson Family," a feature on the Tate LaBianca murders of 6 months earlier. The murders where the word pig had been written in blood on the walls. The murders committed by hippies chanting with a woman in a floppy hat. Ivory stood there looking at the magazine, looking at the pajama top, looking at the living room where a violent struggle was supposed to have occurred and had not. And he began quietly to understand what had happened in this house. Jeffrey MacDonald, in the hospital across the base, was being treated for a minor stab wound. He was stable. He was expected to recover completely. He was, in fact, the only member of the family inside that house who was going to see another sunrise. And across the country on Long Island, at about 9 a.m. Eastern time, a telephone rang in the home of Freddy and Mildred Kassab. Freddy picked it up. It was a long-distance call from Fort Bragg. A voice he didn't recognize was on the other end, an Army chaplain. The chaplain told Freddy that there had been an incident, that Colette had been hurt, that the children had been hurt. Freddy asked the chaplain how badly. The chaplain said he was sorry. He said Colette was gone. He said both of the girls were gone. Freddy Kassab put the phone down. He walked into the kitchen where Mildred was making coffee, and he had to tell his wife that her only daughter was dead, and her 2 granddaughters were dead, and her unborn grandson was dead. All in one morning, all at once. Within 12 hours, Freddy and Mildred Kassab were on a plane to North Carolina. They arrived in Fayetteville late that night. They went straight to Womack Army Hospital, to Jeffrey's bedside, to the man they still, in that moment, loved like a son. And when Jeffrey MacDonald saw his father-in-law walk through the door of his hospital room, he broke down. He sobbed. He held on to Freddy's hand. He told Freddy what had happened. 4 hippies, a blonde woman, a candle, a chant. Acid is groovy. Kill the pigs. Freddy believed him. Of course he believed him. This was his son-in-law. This was the man who had loved Colette since they were 15 years old. For the next 18 months, Freddy Kassab would be Jeffrey MacDonald's fiercest public defender. He would write letters to congressmen. He would give interviews. He would hire private investigators to look for the hippies. He would campaign on every front available to a grieving father for the authorities to find the killers. He would trust Jeffrey completely. And then, in 1971, Jeffrey MacDonald would make one phone call too many. And Freddy Kassab would begin to understand that the son-in-law he had, defended for a year and a half, had been lying to him the entire time. That is where this case turns. But we are not there yet. In the weeks following the murders, the Army's criminal investigation Division focused on one suspect, not a hippie, not a drug cult, Jeffrey MacDonald himself. The evidence at the crime scene did not match his story. The evidence, in fact, contradicted his story at every turn. On April 6, 1970, MacDonald was placed under house arrest, charged with 3 counts of murder. His wife Colette, his 5-year-old daughter Kimberly, his 2-year-old daughter Kristen. MacDonald was shocked. He called his attorney, he called his family, he called Freddy Kassab, and Freddy, still believing his son-in-law completely, was outraged. He wrote to his congressman, he wrote to the army, he demanded MacDonald's release. He argued that there was no evidence to support the charges. Freddy Kassab was, in the summer of 1970, the most vocal defender Jeffrey MacDonald had. The Army convened a preliminary hearing under Article 32 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, the Army's equivalent of a grand jury. The hearing began on July 6, 1970. The presiding officer was a career Army colonel named Warren Rock. Over the course of the hearing, 56 witnesses testified. The hearing lasted nearly 3 months. On October 13th, Colonel Rock issued his report. His conclusion was surprising. Rock recommended that all charges against MacDonald be dismissed. Not because MacDonald was innocent, because the Army had not built a strong enough case. Rock wrote that the charges were, quote, not true. He also recommended something that investigators would remember for the next 4 decades. Rock recommended that the case be turned over to civilian authorities because he believed the crime scene had been mishandled, because he believed there were investigative leads that had not been followed, and because he believed there was still evidence to be found. The Army accepted Rock's recommendation on one point. They dismissed the charges. They did not act on his second recommendation. They did not turn the case over to civilian authorities. Not yet. That would come later. On October 23rd, 1970, Jeffrey MacDonald was an honorably discharged Army captain, a free man, a widower, a grieving father, a doctor looking to start over. He moved to New York, and then a few months later, he moved across country to California. He took a job at St. Mary's Medical Center in Long Beach as the director of emergency medicine. He was good at the job, very good. Colleagues described him as calm under pressure, decisive, a natural leader. He worked long hours, sometimes 80 hours a week, he later said in interviews, that it was easier than sitting alone thinking about his family. He also bought a boat, a yacht, really. He named it Recovery Room. He took it out on weekends. He had a string of girlfriends. In December of 1970, just 6 weeks after the charges were dropped, MacDonald appeared on The Dick Cavett Show. Dick Cavett was one of the most watched talk shows on network television. MacDonald went on national television to tell his story. He criticized the Army investigators. He made jokes. He smiled. He laughed at Cavett's questions. A grieving widower, a grieving father, sitting on a talk show, cracking jokes. 10 months after his family was murdered, Freddy Kassab was watching that broadcast in his living room on Long Island. And for the first time since the murders, Freddy Kassab felt something move in his stomach, something he couldn't name yet, something that felt, for just a moment, like doubt. But he pushed it away. This was his son-in-law. This was Colette's husband. Grief affects people differently. That's what he told himself. Then, in the spring of 1971, Jeffrey MacDonald made a phone call. He called Freddy Kassab at home. He told Freddy that he had some news, that he had gone back to Fayetteville, that he had, with the help of some Green Beret friends, tracked down one of the hippies who had killed Colette, and that he had, as he put it, taken care of the man, meaning killed him. Jeffrey MacDonald told his father-in-law that he had murdered someone in revenge. Freddy Kassab didn't know what to say. He asked MacDonald for details. What was the man's name? MacDonald said he didn't want to say over the phone. He said Freddy should just trust him. After MacDonald hung up, Freddy sat in his living room for a long time, and then he went to work. Freddy Kassab had served in the Canadian Army during World War II, behind enemy lines. He knew how to investigate. He knew how to follow leads. He called the Fayetteville Police Department. He asked them if there had been any unsolved homicides of young men in the area recently. The answer was no, none. He called the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation. Same answer. No unexplained deaths, no missing persons, no bodies found in the woods or the swamps or the rivers near Fort Bragg. If Jeffrey MacDonald had tracked down and killed a hippie, that hippie would be somewhere there was nowhere, which meant Jeffrey MacDonald had lied to his father-in-law deliberately, specifically, and it raised a question Freddy Kassab had never allowed himself to ask before. Why would a man lie about avenging the murder of his own wife? Why would he invent a second killing out of nothing? Freddy could only come up with one answer. A man would only invent such a story to convince someone else that he cared about finding the killers, which meant, logically, that the man inventing the story did not actually care about finding the killers, which meant, logically, that the man inventing the story already knew who the killers were, or was one of them. Freddy Kassab did not sleep well that night, or the night after, or for the next several weeks. He did not tell Mildred, not yet. He kept his suspicion to himself, and in the spring of 1972, Freddy Kassab flew from Long Island to Fayetteville by himself. He rented a car. He drove to Fort Bragg. He went to the house on Castle Drive. The house had been cleaned. The bloodstains had been removed. New tenants had moved in and then moved out. The Army let Freddy walk through it. He was, after all, the father-in-law of the man who had reported the crime. He walked through the living room. He walked through the master bedroom. He walked through the children's rooms. He stood in the spot where Colette had died. He stood in the spot where Kimberly had been beaten. He stood in the spot where Kristen had been stabbed 48 times. And he did what any father who had served behind enemy lines in wartime would do. He tried to reconstruct the crime. Where could the intruders have come in? Where were the signs of struggle? What sound would have carried to the neighbors? Freddy Kassab walked out of that house knowing no hippies had come through that door. There had only ever been one person in that house that night who was capable of what had happened, and that person was his son-in-law. Freddy Kassab flew back to Long Island. He told Mildred she took longer to accept it than he had, but eventually she did. The Kassabs had lost Colette and the grandchildren to murder, and they had lost Jeffrey in a different way to the truth about who he was. What Freddy Kassab did next would define the rest of his life. He did not confront Jeffrey. He did not call the Army. He did not go to the newspapers. He started writing letters, long, careful, documented letters to the Department of Justice, to the United States Attorney's Office in North Carolina, to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He laid out the evidence. He pointed to the inconsistencies in MacDonald's story. He asked over and over for the case to be reopened. For the first year, nobody answered. For the second year, nobody answered. But Freddy Kassab kept writing. He sent his letters by registered mail. He kept copies of every one. He drove to Washington, D.C. He sat in waiting rooms at the Justice Department. He asked to speak to anyone who would listen. He was by any measure an obsessed man, and he did not care who knew it. In the summer of 1974, 4 years after the murders, Freddy Kassab's letters finally reached the right desk. A young Army attorney named Brian Murtaugh had been assigned to review the case. Murtaugh read the file. He read Kassab's letters, and Murtaugh came to the same conclusion Kassab had come to 2 years earlier. MacDonald had killed his family, and the federal government had failed to prove it. But Murtaugh also believed it could still be proven. If the case was built properly, if the evidence was re-examined, Murtaugh convinced the Justice Department to present the case to a federal grand jury. The grand jury convened in 1974. In January of 1975, Jeffrey MacDonald was indicted by a federal grand jury for the murders of his wife and 2 daughters. MacDonald was at this point living in a luxury condominium on the water in Huntington Beach, California. He was making $200,000 a year as an emergency room director. He had a girlfriend. He had the yacht. He had, by any external measure, moved on with his life completely. When FBI agents arrived at his door with the indictment, MacDonald was stunned. He hired a high-powered defense attorney, a man named Bernard Siegel. Siegel would become one of the most devoted defenders in the history of American criminal law. Siegel believed in Jeffrey MacDonald's innocence. He would believe in it for the next 4 decades. Siegel's first move was to argue that MacDonald's right to a speedy trial had been violated. 5 years had passed since the murders. The argument went up the appellate ladder. In 1978, the case reached the United States Supreme Court for the first time. The Supreme Court ruled that the time between the Army's dismissal and the civilian indictment did not violate MacDonald's constitutional rights. The case could proceed to trial. The trial of Jeffrey MacDonald for the murders of his wife and 2 daughters began on July 16, 1979, in a federal courtroom in Raleigh, North Carolina. 9.5 years after the murders, the presiding judge was a career federal jurist named Franklin Dupree. The prosecution team was led by an assistant United States attorney named James Blackburn. His co-counsel was Brian Murtaugh, the same Brian Murtaugh who had read Freddy Kassab's letters 4 years earlier, the same Murtaugh who had presented the case to the grand jury. The defense was led by Bernard Siegel and a local North Carolina attorney named Wade Smith. The jury was made up of 12 residents of eastern North Carolina, ordinary men and women, mostly working class. The trial lasted 6 weeks. It would involve hundreds of exhibits, thousands of pages of documents. But the entire case, all 6 weeks of it, came down to one piece of clothing, Jeffrey MacDonald's blue pajama top. The pajama top had been collected by Agent William Ivory at the crime scene. On the morning of February 17th, 1970, it had been sent to the Army Criminal Investigation Laboratory at Fort Gordon, Georgia. It had been examined by FBI forensic specialists, and the results of that examination had been saved carefully for 9.5 years, waiting for this trial, waiting for this courtroom, waiting for this jury. The prosecution's key forensic expert was a man named Paul Stombaugh, chief of the FBI's Crime Laboratory Chemistry Section. Stombaugh had been studying the pajama top on and off for years, and he was prepared to walk the jury through what he had found. Stombaugh took the stand on August 7th, 1979. He held up the pajama top. He pointed to 48 small, round, smooth holes in the fabric, ice pick holes, made by a standard household ice pick, the same kind of ice pick found in the MacDonald's kitchen. Stombaugh explained that when a fabric is in motion, wrapped around, flailing, arms, for instance, in a fight ice, pick holes are ragged, the fabric tears around the puncture, the edges are jagged. These 48 holes were not ragged, they were perfectly round, which meant the fabric had been stationary. The pajama top had been laid flat when these holes were made. Not fighting, not moving, not defending. Then Stombaugh picked up the pajama top, and he did something the jury would never forget. He folded it in a specific way, the way it had been found, lying across Colette MacDonald's chest. And then he took 48 thin metal probes, and he inserted one probe into each of the 48 holes. When the pajama top was folded correctly, the 48 probes went through the fabric and emerged in 21 distinct points. 21, which was exactly the number of ice pick wounds in Colette MacDonald's chest. The 21 probes emerging from the folded pajama top formed the exact pattern of Colette's wounds. Not approximately, not roughly, exactly. There was only one way that pattern could have been created. Someone had folded the pajama top, laid it across Colette's chest, and driven an ice pick through it 21 times, producing 48 holes in the fabric and 21 wounds in her body. The only person in the house that night who was capable of doing that was Jeffrey MacDonald, because there were no intruders. There had never been any intruders. The jury watched Stombaugh's demonstration in silence. Several jurors later said it was the single most damaging moment of the trial. Freddy Kassab sat in the gallery. He had flown down from Long Island. He had been attending every day. His wife Mildred sat next to him. They watched Stombaugh thread the probes through the pajama top. Mildred later told a reporter that she understood in that moment exactly how Colette had died. She had been lying on the floor of her own bedroom, 4.5 months pregnant, her arms already broken, and her husband had placed his own pajama top over her chest, perhaps, because he couldn't bear to look at her face, and then through the fabric, driven an ice pick into her body 21 times. Mildred Kassab would later say that she wept quietly in the courtroom that day. She also said something else. She said Freddy, sitting beside her, did not cry. Freddy Kassab, who had spent the previous 8 years of his life pursuing this exact moment, did not cry because he had already done his crying years ago. The pajama top demonstration was not the only forensic evidence against MacDonald. It was the most dramatic, but it was not the only one. FBI analysts testified that fibers from MacDonald's pajama top had been found on a Colette's body, on a Kristen's body, under Kimberly's fingernail, on the sheets of Kristen's bed. 19 fibers were inside the bedding in which Kimberly was wrapped, but in the living room where MacDonald claimed he had fought off 4 intruders while wearing the pajama top, there were no fibers. None. Not a single thread from the torn pajama top was found in the room. Where it had supposedly been torn, the fibers were only in the rooms where the victims had died. The rooms where MacDonald said he had never been wearing the top. There was only one explanation. MacDonald had been wearing the pajama top when he attacked his family, not when he was attacked. The prosecution also introduced the blood evidence. Each member of the MacDonald family happened to have a different blood type. Colette was type A. Kimberly was type AB. Kristen was type O. Jeffrey was type B. 4 different blood types, 4 different people. A chemical map of who had bled where. The blood map showed that the attacks had not happened in the sequence MacDonald described. They had happened in a different order entirely. Colette had been attacked in the master bedroom first. Kimberly had come in, probably to help her mother, and had been struck down with the club. MacDonald had then carried Kimberly back to her own room, dropped her on her bed, stabbed her. Then Colette, still alive, had gotten up, staggered across the hall to Kristen's room. To protect her, 2-year-old, MacDonald had followed her, killed her in Kristen's room. Then, still alive and watching Kristen, finally he had dragged Colette's body back to the master bedroom, staged the scene, written the word pig in her blood on the headboard, torn his own pajama top, given himself a minor stab wound, and called the military police. The jury heard all of this. 6 weeks of testimony, 6 weeks of forensic evidence, 6 weeks of watching Jeffrey MacDonald sit at the defense table still, handsome, still calm, still claiming innocence. On August 28th, closing arguments were delivered. The jury went into deliberation the next morning. They came back 6.5 hours later with a verdict. Guilty on all 3 counts. Second-degree murder of Colette, second-degree murder of Kimberly, first-degree murder of Kristen. Judge Dupree sentenced Jeffrey MacDonald immediately to 3 consecutive life terms in federal prison. Freddy and Mildred Kassab were in the courtroom when the verdict was read. MacDonald's mother, sitting in a pew across the aisle, collapsed when she heard the word guilty. Freddy Kassab, according to a reporter who was there, simply closed his eyes and nodded as if to say, finally. But it was not finally, not yet, because Jeffrey MacDonald was not done. And the case that Freddy Kassab had fought for 9 years to bring to trial would, within 12 months, be overturned. And Jeffrey MacDonald would walk out of federal prison, a free man. Again, Jeffrey MacDonald was taken into federal custody on August 29th, 1979. He was sent to a federal correctional institution. He began serving his 3 consecutive life sentences, and Bernard Segal, his attorney, went to work on the appeal. Segal's argument was the same one he had raised before the trial, that MacDonald's right to a speedy trial had been violated. 9.5 years between the murders and the conviction, 4.5 years between the indictment and the verdict. The case went to the 4th Circuit Court of Appeals in Richmond, Virginia. In July of 1980, the 4th Circuit issued its ruling, 2-1. The conviction was overturned. Jeffrey MacDonald was ordered released from federal prison. On July 29th, 1980, less than a year after his conviction, MacDonald walked out of prison. He flew back to California. He returned to his job at Street Mary's. He returned to his condominium. He returned to his life. Freddy Kassab on Long Island was 63 years old. He had spent the last 9 years of his life pursuing this case, and he was going to have to keep pursuing it. The federal government appealed the 4th Circuit's ruling. The case was sent to the Supreme Court of the United States for a second time. Oral arguments were heard on December 7th, 1981. The decision came 4 months later. On March 31st, 1982, the Supreme Court issued its ruling, 6 justices to 3. The court reversed the 4th Circuit. It ruled that MacDonald's right to a speedy trial had not been violated. The conviction was reinstated. MacDonald's 3 life sentences were restored. Jeffrey MacDonald was rearrested at his office in California. He was returned to federal prison. He has been there ever since. For 15 months, MacDonald had been a free man. After the Supreme Court ruling, he never would be again. In the summer of 1979, before the trial, MacDonald had made a decision that would define the rest of his public life. He had hired a journalist named Joe McGinniss to write a book about the case. McGinniss was given unprecedented access. He sat at the defense table during the trial. He slept in the same house as the defense team. He went on vacation with MacDonald. MacDonald believed McGinniss was going to write a book defending his innocence. McGinniss began the project believing the same thing. But somewhere during those months of access watching MacDonald, interviewing him, reading the evidence, Joe McGinniss came to a different conclusion. In 1983, McGinniss published his book. He called it Fatal Vision. The book was not a defense of Jeffrey MacDonald. It was a 600-page indictment of him. McGinniss wrote that MacDonald was a narcissist, a pathological liar, a man who had, in McGinniss's own conclusion, murdered his family in a rage and then spent the rest of his life denying it. Fatal Vision became a national bestseller. It was adapted into a 4-hour television miniseries that aired on NBC in 1984. Carl Malden, one of the most respected actors of his generation, played Freddy Kassab. He won an Emmy Award for the performance. Millions of Americans watched the miniseries. For an entire generation of viewers, Fatal Vision became the definitive account of the case. Jeffrey MacDonald, furious, sued Joe McGinniss for fraud. He argued that McGinniss had pretended to believe in his innocence in order to gain access. The lawsuit dragged on for 4 years. It ended in 1987 in a hung jury. A settlement was reached. MacDonald received $325,000. The book remained in print. It remains in print today. For the rest of his life, Jeffrey MacDonald would blame Fatal Vision for his public image, for the jury's perception of him, for the decades of failed appeals, for the fact that no matter what new evidence emerged, America had already made up its mind. Fatal Vision had sealed the story. But MacDonald was not done fighting. He would never be done fighting. For the next 2 decades, he and a rotating team of attorneys filed motion after motion, appeal after appeal. He hired private investigators. He gave prison interviews. He wrote long letters to journalists. He insisted every single day that he was innocent, that the hippies had done it, that a woman named Helena Stokely had been in his house that night. Helena Stokely was a real person, a young woman from Fayetteville, a known drug user in 1970. She had, in the years after the murders, occasionally claimed to have been involved. Other times, she denied any involvement. Her stories changed constantly. She was heavily addicted to drugs. She was, by every professional assessment, an unreliable witness. At the 1979 trial, Judge Dupree had ruled that Stokely's statements could not be presented to the jury because they were not reliable. Helena Stokely died in 1983, cirrhosis of the liver. She was 32 years old. MacDonald would continue to point to Stokely, even after her death, as proof of his innocence. He would point to her for the rest of his life. But there was one thing Helena Stokely could no longer do after 1983. She could no longer be tested, which meant that when the technology finally became available, the technology that could end this debate forever, it would have to use samples taken from her body after death. And it would have to wait. In the 1990s, DNA testing transformed American criminal justice. Cases that had been cold for decades were being solved. Innocence Project lawyers were freeing wrongly convicted men from death rows across the country. And Jeffrey MacDonald's legal team saw an opportunity. If DNA testing could free innocent men, maybe it could free MacDonald. In 1997, MacDonald's attorneys petitioned a federal court for DNA testing of the physical evidence from the crime scene. They wanted hairs tested, blood samples tested, fibers tested. They wanted the results compared to DNA samples taken from Helena Stokely's body and from her former boyfriend, a man named Gregory Mitchell, who MacDonald's defense had named as another of the intruders. The court granted the motion. The testing began. It was sent to the Armed Forces DNA Identification Laboratory. The laboratory was, at the time, handling other high-priority work, identifying remains from the September 11th attacks, identifying soldiers killed in Iraq and Afghanistan. The MacDonald testing was delayed for 9 years. 9 years of waiting. On March 10th, 2006, the Armed Forces DNA Identification Laboratory filed its report with the United States District Court. The report was released publicly the same day. By the United States Attorney's Office in Raleigh, the results were clear, unambiguous, final. The DNA of Helena Stokely did not match any of the forensic samples from the crime scene. The DNA of Gregory Mitchell did not match any of the forensic samples from the crime scene. There was no evidence anywhere in the house at 544 Castle Drive of either person MacDonald had named as his attackers. For 36 years, MacDonald had said Helena Stokely was in his house. Modern forensic science, using technology that did not exist in 1970, confirmed that she was not, but the DNA testing found something else, something MacDonald had not expected. The single Caucasian limb hair found clutched in Colette MacDonald's left palm, the hair MacDonald had pointed to for years as proof of an intruder, was tested. It did not come from a hippie. It did not come from an intruder. It came from Jeffrey MacDonald himself, a hair from his own body, in his dying wife's hand, torn out during the struggle because she had been trying in her last seconds of life to identify the man who was killing her. Not a stranger, not a hippie, her husband. The 2006 DNA report was the final piece of evidence ever to emerge in the Jeffrey MacDonald case. It confirmed what William Ivory had known on the morning of February 17, 1970. It confirmed what Freddy Kassab had known in the spring of 1972. It confirmed what the jury had concluded on August 29, 1979. Jeffrey MacDonald had killed his wife. He had killed his two little girls. He had killed his unborn son. And he had lied about it every day for 36 years. But there was one person who did not live to see the DNA results. Freddy Kassab died on February 9th, 1994. He was 77 years old. Heart failure. He had spent the last 24 years of his life pursuing justice for Colette and Kimberly and Kristen. He had written thousands of letters. He had testified at hearings. He had sat in courtrooms. He had given interviews. He had watched Joe McGinniss write Fatal Vision. He had watched Carl Malden play him on television. And he had watched Jeffrey MacDonald walk out of prison briefly in 1980 and then walk back permanently in 1982. He did not live to see the DNA confirmation in 2006, but he had by then already been proven right by the evidence, by the jury, by the Supreme Court. Twice, he did not need DNA to know what he knew. Mildred Kassab lived another 13 years after Freddy's death. She died in 2007. She did live to see the DNA results. She was 91 years old when the Armed Forces Laboratory released its report. A reporter asked her if the DNA results gave her any sense of closure. Mildred said no. She said closure was a word for people who had not lost a daughter and 2 grandchildren. She said the only thing the DNA confirmed was what she had already known, and what it did not do was bring anyone back. Jeffrey MacDonald is, as of the making of this video, still alive. He is 81 years old. He is housed in a federal medical prison in Maryland. He has, over the course of his imprisonment, filed dozens of appeals. Every single one has been denied. In December of 2018, the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals rejected his last major claim for a new trial. In April of 2021, a federal judge denied MacDonald's request for compassionate release. His attorneys had argued that he was elderly, in poor health, and had been a model prisoner. The judge was unpersuaded. In September of 2021, MacDonald withdrew his final appeal. He will, in all probability, die in prison. He has twice waived his right to petition for parole, because petitioning for parole requires expressing remorse. And Jeffrey MacDonald, after all these years, will not say he is sorry for something he insists he did not do. He has remarried while in prison twice. He has a support website. He has a newsletter. He has a small but dedicated group of believers. He has also 46 years behind bars and counting. I want to leave you with a few things before I close this video. Colette MacDonald is buried in Patchogue, Long Island, New York. Her grave is next to Kimberly's, which is next to Kristen's. The unborn boy, the third child, is buried in the same plot as his mother. He never got a name. Freddy and Mildred Kassab are buried in the same cemetery. A few rows away, the family is together now, all except the one who put them there. I keep thinking about the afternoon of February 16th, 1970. The day before the murders, Jeffrey MacDonald had taken his two daughters out to see the Christmas pony, Trooper. He had lifted them into the saddle, one at a time. He had led the pony in slow circles around the field. Kimberly was 5, Kristen was 2. When they came home that evening, Kimberly's hair still smelled like the horse. Her mother gave her a bath. And later that night, Kristen, the 2-year-old, the one who would suffer the most, climbed on her father's back. And he played horsey. He crawled around on his hands and knees, pretending to be a pony, like Trooper, like the Christmas pony. That is the last happy memory this family ever had. 8 hours later, the father who had been playing horsey was stabbing his 2-year-old daughter 48 times in her bill. I don't know how to make sense of that. I don't think anyone does. This case has been argued for 55 years as a legal question, a forensic question, a procedural question. Did the Army mishandle the scene? Did the prosecution prove its case? Did the Supreme Court rule correctly? Those are important questions. The answers by every court that has heard them are yes, yes, and yes. But there is a question the courts cannot answer. A question Freddy Kassab could never answer. A question Joe McGinniss could not answer. Why did a man who loved his family, and there is no evidence anywhere that Jeffrey MacDonald did not love his family, kill them on a rainy Tuesday morning? In February, the prosecution theorized that MacDonald had gotten into a fight with Colette, that Kristen had wet the bed, that a small argument had escalated, that MacDonald had, in a sudden and catastrophic rage, struck Colette, that Kimberly had intervened, that once he had killed one, he could not afford to leave the other two alive. So he kept going, and when it was over, he wrote "pig" on the headboard. He placed an Esquire magazine open to a Manson article. He stabbed himself carefully in a place he knew he could treat. He called the military police. That is the prosecution's theory. It fits the evidence. It is almost certainly what happened, but it does not answer the question. It does not explain how a man who played horsey with his daughter at 7 in the evening could stab her 48 times at 4 in the morning. That is the question that has haunted this case for 55 years, and it will continue to haunt it after MacDonald dies, because nobody, including him, has ever given an answer. Freddy Kassab died 12 years before the DNA confirmed what he already knew. He died knowing he had been right. He died knowing that the son-in-law he had loved, the Princeton boy, the Army doctor, the Green Beret, had killed his daughter. He did not get the satisfaction of watching the DNA report come in, but he had gotten something else. He had gotten the conviction. He had gotten the 3 life sentences. He had gotten Jeffrey MacDonald sent to prison permanently for a man who, in the spring of 1971, had been the only person in America who suspected the truth. That was enough. Colette Stevenson MacDonald was 26 years old. She was 4 and a half months pregnant with her 3rd child. She taught developmental psychology. She had been married since she was 20. She had 2 little girls and a Christmas pony named Trooper. She was killed in her own bedroom by the man who had loved her since they were 15 years old. Kimberly MacDonald was 5. Kristen MacDonald was 2. They are buried together on Long Island, New York. The headstones share a single plot. The girls are on either side of their mother, which is how they slept most nights. Anyway, that is the only final verdict this case will ever have.